Picture the US-Canada border, 5,525 miles from ocean to ocean. No fences, no walls, no armed guards, just forests, lakes, and small towns where you can cross over for gas or groceries. It's peaceful. The kind of border that makes you forget borders can be dangerous. We've been told a story about this line our whole lives. The longest undefended border in the world. A symbol of friendship. There's even a Peace Arch monument in Washington state that reads, "Children of a Common Mother." It's a nice story. It's also a lie. In 1974, someone at the National Archives pulled out a folder marked Secret. Inside was a 94-page document that had been hidden for decades. When it went public, newspapers on both sides of the border ran shocking headlines. This was War Plan Red, the United States military's official blueprint to invade and conquer Canada. Not defend against Canada, invade it, conquer it, erase it from the map. The plan had troop movements, bombing targets, chemical weapons authorization, a $57 million budget, 3 secret airfields along the border disguised as civilian airports, reconnaissance flights by Charles Lindbergh. The goal? Permanent annexation. Turn Canadian provinces into U.S. states. Canada was the first target. How does something like this happen? How do you go from friendly neighbors to planning a full-scale invasion? You have to go back to the 1920s. World War I had just ended. Millions dead, Europe in ruins, and the world order was completely scrambled. The United States came out strong, booming economy, growing military, confidence sky high. But Britain? Britain was bleeding. They'd won the war, sure, but at what cost? $22 billion in debt to America. Their empire stretched so thin it was starting to tear, their economy struggling. And here's where things got tense. In 1927, there was a naval conference in Geneva. The idea was simple. Let's talk, set some limits, make sure we don't slip into another arms race. Britain and America sat down to negotiate, but the talks fell apart. Completely. The British wanted one thing, the Americans wanted another, and neither side would budge. When the conference collapsed, the temperature between these two countries dropped fast. Now, Britain still had the world's most powerful navy, bases everywhere, control of the seas. But American military planners weren't intimidated. They saw weakness, a declining empire, an empire that owed them money, an empire that might get desperate, an empire that could become an enemy. And if there was going to be a war between America and Britain, where would it start? Look at a map. The answer is staring you in the face. Canada. Back then, Canada wasn't independent like it is today. It was a British dominion, tied legally to the Crown. When Britain declared war, Canada declared war. British troops could be stationed there. British ships could use Canadian ports. To American strategists, Canada wasn't a neighbor. Canada was Britain's forward operating base, a dagger pointed south. So the Pentagon started planning. Not because they wanted war, but because it seemed possible, maybe even likely. And when generals plan for war, they don't plan to tie. They plan to win. Fast and brutal. The U.S. military used color codes for their war plans. And America was always blue, Japan was orange, Germany was black, Britain was red, the color of the British Empire on old maps. And Canada? Canada got its own special designation, crimson. The planners got to work. These weren't crazy people. They were professionals, colonels and generals who'd fought in France during World War I, men who understood logistics and strategy, and the cold math of warfare. They worked in offices in Washington, behind locked doors, studying maps and railway schedules and Canadian military strength. And what they found made them confident. Canada's entire army was fewer than 4,000 soldiers. The U.S. could mobilize 12.5 million. The planners didn't just count soldiers. They cataloged everything. Every destroyer, every railway line, every power plant. They sent officers on tourist trips to Canada to photograph bridges and sketch fortifications. Nobody suspected a thing. The intelligence was staggering. The U.S. knew more about Canadian infrastructure than Canada did. This wasn't going to be a fair fight. The strategy they developed was methodical, surgical, and absolutely terrifying if you read it today. Step 1. Hit Halifax. Halifax, Nova Scotia. If you've never been there, picture a city built into hills overlooking a massive natural harbor. One of the deepest, most protected harbors on the entire Atlantic coast. Water so deep that the largest battleships in the world could dock there. And here's the critical part. It doesn't freeze. Even in the brutal Canadian winter, Halifax Harbor stays open. In the 1930s, this was Britain's lifeline to North America. The undersea telegraph cable connecting Britain to Canada came ashore in Halifax. The Royal Navy had a base there. When Britain needed to send troops or supplies to Canada, they'd come through Halifax. It was the door between the British Empire and the North American continent. The American planners understood this perfectly. Take Halifax, and you slam that door shut. Britain can't reinforce Canada, can't resupply their forces, can't establish a foothold for a counterattack. Without Halifax, Canada is isolated, alone, defenseless. So Halifax would be destroyed first, immediately, without warning. The plan was brutally specific. American warships would approach from the Atlantic under radio silence. Meanwhile, ground troops would mass just south of the border in Maine. When the order came, the ships would open fire on the harbor installations, while troops landed at St. Margaret's Bay, a quiet fishing area about 15 miles west of the city. But before any of that happened, before the ships arrived, before the troops landed, there would be gas. Let me be very clear about what this means. We're not talking about tear gas. We're not talking about smoke screens. The plan authorized mustard gas, chlorine gas, and phosgene, the same chemical weapons that turned World War I into a nightmare. Weapons that burn your lungs from the inside out. Weapons that blister your skin. Weapons that kill slowly and agonizingly, and the plan called for using them on a city, on civilians, on families sleeping in their beds, workers heading to their jobs, children walking to school. The 1934 update to War Plan Red used very specific language. Make all necessary preparations for the use of chemical warfare from the outbreak of the war. The use of chemical warfare, including toxic agents, from the inception of hostilities, is authorized. Not if the enemy uses gas first, not as a last resort. From the inception of hostilities, meaning the very first thing Halifax would experience in this war would be poison gas raining down from American bombers. The planners estimated it would take 48 hours to fully secure Halifax once the gas attack began, maybe less. The city would be paralyzed, its defenders choking and dying, unable to mount organized resistance. American troops would walk in and take control of the port, the naval base, the telegraph station, cut the undersea cables, destroy the fortifications, turn the guns around to point out to sea, and if somehow the gas didn't work, if Halifax held out longer than expected, the backup plan was almost worse. cut off all of Nova Scotia. Send troops through New Brunswick and seize Moncton, a small city that controlled the railway junction connecting Nova Scotia to the rest of Canada. With Moncton captured, Nova Scotia becomes an island. No supplies can get in by rail. The U.S. Navy would blockade the coastline. No supplies by sea either. Then you wait. Let them starve. Let them realize there's no help coming. Let them surrender. But the planners didn't think it would come to that. They were confident Halifax would fall in the first 48 hours. Because Halifax was just the opening move, the first domino. Once it fell, the real invasion would cascade across the entire country. Step 2. Take Quebec and Montreal. The St. Lawrence River is Canada's jugular vein. Trade, grain, iron ore, everything flows through it. And sitting on the St. Lawrence were Quebec City and Montreal. Quebec City was the old French capital. Stone walls, historic fortifications, but useless against modern weapons. Montreal was Canada's economic engine. Banking center, manufacturing hub, crucial port facilities. The plan called for simultaneous attacks. Troops from Vermont would drive north toward Quebec City via routes 11 and 7. A larger force from New York would strike Montreal from the south. Quebec would fall within 72 hours. Montreal in 48. Here's the brutal part. Both cities were majority French-speaking. American planners studied French-Canadian attitudes, believing they might not resist as fiercely as English Canadians. Maybe naive, but it shaped the plan. Once both cities fell, Canada would be split in two. The St. Lawrence controlled. No way to move troops or supplies east to west. Step 3. Seize Ontario and the Great Lakes. This was the industrial heartland, the beating heart of Canada's economy. And the Americans wanted it intact. Ontario in the 1930s was where Canada built things. Steel mills in Hamilton, auto plants in Windsor and Oshawa, shipyards, factories producing everything from textiles to munitions, and most importantly, the hydroelectric plants at Niagara Falls. Those power plants were critical. They generated massive amounts of electricity that powered factories across southern Ontario and even parts of New York State. The falls themselves were split between Canada and the U.S., but the Canadian side had the better viewing angle and the bigger power generation facilities. In peacetime, they shared the electricity. In wartime, whoever controlled those plants controlled the region's industrial capacity. The plan called for 3 simultaneous attacks across Ontario, timed to hit within hours of each other. Attack 1. Buffalo to Niagara Falls. American troops would cross the Niagara River, and yes, they'd have to cross right near the falls, which tells you how serious they were. Engineers had studied the current, the depth, the potential crossing points. They'd identified 3 places where pontoon bridges could be thrown across under cover of artillery fire. Once across, troops would race to secure the power plants before Canadian forces could sabotage them. The orders were explicit. Capture the facilities intact. And don't blow them up. Don't damage the generators. America wanted that electricity flowing south, not shut down. Attack 2. Detroit to Toronto. This would be the largest single operation in the invasion. Troops massing in Detroit would cross the Detroit River and drive northeast toward Toronto. The distance is only about 225 miles, and the roads were good even in the 1930s. Toronto was Canada's second-largest city, but it had virtually no military defenses. Some old Fort York buildings from the War of 1812. A few armories. Nothing that could stop a modern mechanized army. The plan estimated American tanks would be in downtown Toronto within 36 hours of crossing the border. Attack 3. Sault Ste. Marie. This northern pincer would secure the locks between Lake Superior and Lake Huron. Control those locks, and you control shipping on the Great Lakes. The plan called for seizing them quickly and intact. No sabotage allowed. Because the Americans didn't just want to conquer Canada, they wanted to use its infrastructure. But there was another target in Ontario that doesn't get mentioned as much in the declassified documents, but it was absolutely critical: the nickel mines near Sudbury. Sudbury, Ontario produced 90% of the world's nickel in the 1930s. 90%. And nickel was essential for making armor plating for warships and tanks. Britain desperately needed that nickel. If war broke out between the US and Britain, cutting off British access to Canadian nickel would cripple the Royal Navy's ability to build or repair ships. The plan specifically mentioned securing the Sudbury mines intact. Take them over, keep them running, but redirect the nickel south to American steel mills instead of east to British shipyards. This wasn't just about conquest. This was about resource denial, about making sure Britain couldn't wage a long war even if they wanted to. And with Ontario secured, with the industrial base under American control, with the power still flowing and the factories still running, just under new management, the invasion would roll west. Step 4. Cut the railway at Winnipeg. Here's where the plan gets really clever and really ruthless. Winnipeg, Manitoba sits right in the center of Canada, about equidistant from the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Most Americans in the 1930s couldn't find it on a map. It was just some prairie city, cold, remote, forgettable. But to military planners studying Canadian infrastructure, Winnipeg was the most important city in the entire country. Why? Because every single transcontinental railway line in Canada passed through Winnipeg. Every single one. If you wanted to move troops from Halifax to Vancouver, they went through Winnipeg. If you wanted to ship grain from Saskatchewan to Montreal, it went through Winnipeg. If you wanted to send ammunition from Ontario to British Columbia, it traveled through Winnipeg. The city was the railway hub, the central nervous system of Canadian transportation. And the American planners understood that if you cut the railways at Winnipeg, you didn't just slow down Canadian troop movements, you paralyzed them completely. The geography made Winnipeg almost indefensible. The city sits on flat prairie, surrounded by farmland in every direction. No mountains. No major rivers creating natural barriers. No forests to hide defending forces. Just open prairie. Perfect tank country. The plan called for a lightning strike from North Dakota. A small, fast-moving mechanized force. Maybe 5,000 troops with armored vehicles and mobile artillery. They'd cross the border at Pembina or Walhalla, drive north on Highway 75, and cover the 65 miles to Winnipeg in a matter of hours. Hit the city before Canadian forces even knew the invasion had started. The objective wasn't to occupy Winnipeg long-term. The objective was surgical destruction. Blow up the rail yards. Destroy the switching stations. Tear up the tracks radiating out from the city in all directions. Burn the roundhouses where locomotives were serviced. Demolish the bridges over the Red River and Assiniboine River. Then pull back. Leave Winnipeg standing but isolated. Cut off. With its railway hub destroyed, Western Canada becomes an island. Troops in British Columbia can't move east to help defend Ontario. Grain from Alberta can't reach the ports. Reinforcements from Britain landing in Vancouver can't reach the fighting in Quebec. The western provinces would be alive, but paralyzed. Able to see the disaster unfolding in the east, but unable to help. Unable to move. Unable to fight effectively. And that's when the final hammer would fall on the West Coast. Step 5. Take Vancouver, the final piece of the puzzle, the last major target, and the one that reveals the true ambition of this plan. Vancouver, British Columbia, was Canada's gateway to the Pacific. In the 1930s, it was a rapidly growing port city handling lumber, grain, fish, mine, and minerals heading to Asian markets. It had a natural deep-water harbor, rail connections to the rest of Canada, and most importantly, from a military perspective, it was the only major Pacific port Britain could use as a naval base in North America. If Britain wanted to project power in the Pacific, they'd do it through Vancouver. If they wanted to threaten American shipping to Asia, they'd use Vancouver as a staging point. If they wanted to potentially ally with Japan against the United States, which the planners considered a very real possibility, Vancouver would be the link point. So Vancouver had to be taken, completely, permanently. The plan called for a two-pronged assault from the south. Ground forces from Washington State would drive north on Route 99. The plan literally specified the highway number. They'd cross the border at Blaine and push north the 30 miles to Vancouver. Simultaneously, the U.S. Navy would shell Victoria on Vancouver Island and conduct amphibious landings to secure the island's ports and military installations. But here's where the plan becomes truly chilling. Because when you read the actual war plan red documents, when you see the language they used about Vancouver and British Columbia, you realize this wasn't about temporary occupation. The plan states explicitly, the policy will be to prepare the provinces and territories of Crimson to become U.S. states and territories upon the declaration of peace. Read that again. U.S. states and territories, not occupied zones, not temporary military administration, states. The planners envisioned British Columbia becoming an American state, the Alberta and Saskatchewan becoming states, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, all of them absorbed into the United States. The plan even discussed how to handle the French-speaking population of Quebec. Would they get a separate state? Would they be divided up? The documents debate these questions like they're discussing county lines in Iowa. And it gets darker. There are references in the supporting documents to Anglicization programs and cultural integration strategies. Bureaucratic language that means cultural erasure, teaching American history in schools, replacing Canadian symbols with American ones, phasing out the British connection completely, making it so that within a generation, nobody would remember Canada had ever existed as a separate country. This wasn't war. This was annexation, absorption, the complete elimination of Canada as a nation. And the planners were confident it would work. Because once you control the territory, once you've defeated the army, once you've captured all the major cities and industrial centers, what's left? A bunch of scattered communities with no central government, no military, no ability to resist. The British would be on the other side of the Atlantic, unable to help. The Canadian people would be faced with a choice: accept American rule or face continued occupation and hardship. The planners bet that most Canadians would eventually accept it, especially if America offered them the same rights and representation as American citizens. Make them states, give them senators and congressmen, integrate them into the American economy. Within a decade, the plan suggested, most Canadians would forget they'd ever been Canadian. It was colonialism wrapped in the language of democracy, conquest disguised as liberation, and it was all written down, approved, and funded by the United States government. Now here's where this stops being a theoretical exercise and becomes something real, something tangible, something that actually happened. In February 1935, the U.S. Congress held hearings on a military appropriations bill. Buried in that bill was a line item for $57 million, nearly $1 billion in today's money, to construct 3 military airfields along the Canadian border. The official justification was vague. Strategic air defense installations, or something equally bureaucratic. But when you read the classified war plan red documents, the purpose becomes crystal clear. These weren't defensive installations. They were forward air bases for bombers, staging grounds for the invasion. The locations were chosen very specifically. One near Oswego, New York, positioned to strike Montreal and Ottawa. One near Detroit, positioned to support the Ontario invasion. One in North Dakota, positioned to support the strike on Winnipeg. Each airfield would be disguised as a civilian airport. They'd have some passenger service, maybe some freight operations. But the runways would be military grade. Long enough and strong enough to handle heavy bombers. The fuel depots would be oversized. The hangars would be built to military specifications. And construction began. They actually built these airfields. Contractors poured concrete. Workers erected buildings. The facilities went up under the cover story of civilian aviation development. Then somebody in the government printing office made a massive mistake. In May 1935, the office published a brochure describing new government infrastructure projects. Somebody included the airfield construction. Somebody mentioned they were strategic air bases for potential operations in the Northern Theater. And somebody at the New York Times saw it. The story hit the front page. U.S. builds secret air bases along Canadian border. The cat was out of the bag. Canadian newspapers picked it up. There was outrage in Ottawa, quiet panic in the Canadian government. American officials scrambled to explain it away. Just contingency planning, they said. Just training facilities. Nothing to worry about. The Canadian government, not wanting to provoke a crisis, publicly accepted these explanations. But privately, they knew exactly what those airfields meant. And the military exercises kept going. In August 1935, the U.S. military conducted what was then the largest war game in American history. The official name was something innocuous. The actual purpose was to test the invasion plan. Fort Drum, New York. Just east of the St. Lawrence River, less than 50 miles from the Canadian border. You could see Canada from some of the training areas. 36,500 troops participated. Another 15,000 were kept in reserve in Pennsylvania. This wasn't a few units doing some drills. This was a full-scale mock invasion. Infantry divisions practiced river crossings. Tank battalions practiced breaking through defensive lines. Artillery units practiced suppressing fortifications. Engineers practiced building pontoon bridges under fire, and the newsreel cameras were there. You can find this footage if you search for it. Black and white film showing thousands of soldiers in formation, columns of trucks stretching to the horizon, bivouacked tents covering entire fields, artillery pieces firing, troops advancing through smoke, tanks rolling across farmland. It looks like preparation for war, because that's exactly what it was. The exercises ran for 2 weeks. The scenario, according to declassified documents, involved repelling an invasion from the north. But in practice, all the movements mirrored offensive operations. Crossing water barriers, seizing strategic points, rapid advances into enemy territory. The troops were practicing invasion, not defense. Canadian observers watched from across the border. They filed reports back to Ottawa. The message was clear. This isn't theoretical. They're actually preparing to do this. And then there was Lindbergh, Charles Lindbergh, American hero. First solo flight across the Atlantic. By the early 1930s, he'd become a military consultant helping with the Canada problem. Starting around 1932, Lindbergh made secret reconnaissance flights over Canadian territory. Hudson Bay, the Arctic, major cities. He was scouting, taking photos, filing reports. What he found? Canadian air defenses were almost non-existent. A few obsolete fighters. No modern anti-aircraft guns, no radar. American bombers could operate over Canada with near total impunity. His main recommendation was chilling. Use chemical weapons from the start. Lindbergh's logic was cold. Chemical weapons create panic, overwhelm hospitals, contaminate cities, break morale. Most importantly, to prevent organized resistance in the critical first 24 to 48 hours. His recommendation specifically targeted Halifax. Gas the city before any ground assault. Make it uninhabitable. Then walk in once the gas dispersed. The planners listened. The 1934 update authorized chemical weapons for immediate use. The language is in the declassified documents. The use of chemical warfare, including toxic agents, from the inception of hostilities, is authorized. This violated the 1925 Geneva Protocol. The U.S. had signed it. But in a war for North America, international law was apparently optional. Lindbergh would later become infamous for Nazi sympathies, visiting Germany, praising the Luftwaffe, opposing U.S. intervention in World War II. But in the early 1930s, he was still a hero, and his recommendation to gas Canadian cities was taken seriously at the highest levels of American military power. Canada knew what was happening. Of course they knew. Canadian intelligence officers watched the American war games. They read the newspaper reports about the airfields. They saw Lindbergh's planes flying over their territory. They weren't stupid. They understood the threat. And that's why Canada created its own desperate plan. Defense Scheme Number 1. The man behind it was Lieutenant Colonel James Buster Sutherland Brown. Brown was Canadian Military Intelligence's Director of Operations. He'd fought in World War I, distinguished himself in planning and logistics, earned a reputation as a brilliant strategic thinker. And after the war, now he came home to Canada with one burning question. How do we defend ourselves against the Americans? He studied the problem obsessively. He looked at population numbers. Canada had about 10 million people. The U.S. had 120 million. He looked at military strength. Canada's entire army was tiny. The Americans could field millions. He looked at geography. Most of Canada's population lived within 100 miles of the U.S. border, exposed and vulnerable. The conclusion was inescapable. Canada couldn't win a defensive war against the United States, not even close. If the Americans invaded, Canada would be overrun within weeks, maybe days. So Brown proposed something radical, something almost suicidal. If you can't defend, attack first. In 1921, Brown drafted Defense Scheme Number 1. The plan called for immediate preemptive strikes if war seemed imminent. Fast flying columns would rush across the border before Americans could mobilize. Vancouver forces would seize Seattle. Alberta forces would capture Great Falls. Manitoba forces would hit Minneapolis. Ontario forces would drive into New York and take Albany. Quebec forces would strike Maine and Vermont. Maximum destruction. Blow bridges, tear up railways, destroy power stations, create chaos. Then retreat when American reinforcements arrived, sabotaging everything behind them. The hope was this would buy 6 weeks, maybe 2 months, for Britain to send help. Brown even crossed into the U.S. on reconnaissance missions, dressed as a tourist, buying maps at gas stations and photographing bridges. His notes are darkly funny. He described Vermont men as fat and lazy but pleasant, and Vermont women as heavy and not very comely. But Brown's plan was fantasy. He hadn't coordinated with British planners, who'd already concluded defending Canada was impossible. British assessments were brutal. Canada is too big, too close to America, too far from Britain. If war came, Canada would fall. Write it off and focus on defeating the U.S. Navy. Brown's plan relied on help that was never coming. His successor, Andrew MacNaughton, hated it so much he ordered all copies destroyed in 1928, called it suicidal. But the plan proved Canada took the American threat seriously. While Canada's plan was scrapped, America's was being expanded and funded. And then the world shifted. Hitler came to power in Germany. Fascism spread. Japan invaded China. From the global order started crumbling, and suddenly Britain and America looked at each other and realized they had bigger problems. Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill started talking, not as rivals, but as potential allies. Diplomatic relations warmed. The old rivalry faded. In 1939, War Plan Red was officially withdrawn. Filed away, classified. The airfields stayed but were redesignated for other purposes. The troops went home. The invasion plans gathered dust. But they had been real. When the plan was declassified in 1974, officials on both sides rushed to downplay it. Just a training exercise, they said. Just theoretical planning. Historians agreed, eager not to damage the modern friendship between the two countries. But read the documents yourself. Read the funding allocations. Look at the airfields. Look at the poison gas authorizations. War Plan Red wasn't theoretical. It was operational. It was days or weeks away from being executed on multiple occasions. If history had turned slightly differently, if Roosevelt hadn't seen the Nazi threat clearly, if Britain had made one more aggressive move, if the 1927 Geneva Conference had ended in war instead of cold resentment, Canada would have burned. And here's what should keep you up at night. The geography hasn't changed. That border is still there. 5,525 miles of peaceful frontier. Canada still has resources America needs. Fresh water, oil, minerals, increasingly valuable Arctic territory as the ice melts and shipping routes open up. And Canada still has a small military, a small population, and a government that depends on American goodwill. There's no War Plan Red today. No classified invasion blueprint sitting in a vault. The U.S. and Canada are genuine allies. NATO binds them. Trade integrates their economies. Culture blurs the line between them. But the capacity is still there. The ability is still there. And in the brutal logic of geopolitics, capacity and ability matter more than friendship. What happens when resources get scarce? When water becomes more valuable than oil? When climate change makes the Arctic the new strategic prize? What happens if the political situation shifts? If a different kind of leader takes power? If the global order collapses the way it did in the 1920s? What's stopping the unthinkable from becoming thinkable again? A line on a map? A shared history? Economic ties? Or just the fact that so far, it hasn't been necessary? When War Plan Red teaches a hard lesson, friendship between nations isn't natural law. It's a choice that depends on circumstances, leadership, and luck. The peaceful border exists not because war is impossible, but because war hasn't been necessary. Yet. The plan was real. The funding was real. The airfields were real. The poison gas authorizations were real. And while the plan was never executed, while Canada never burned, the fact that it came so close should terrify us. Because the next time someone tells you about the world's longest undefended border, about the peaceful friendship, about how America and Canada are basically the same country, you'll know the truth. You'll know about the 94-page document, the $57 million, the chemical weapons, the invasion routes, the plan to erase Canada from the map. You'll know that peace isn't guaranteed, that borders are held by choices, not destiny, and that somewhere in history's shadow, there's always a contingency plan, always a document marked secret, always a blueprint for what nations are capable of when they think their interests demand it. War Plan Red is no longer active, but its lesson never expires. The geography is still there. The capacity is still there. The logic is still there. And history never really ends. It just waits.